first video, we talked about the overall harm corporate models and the pursuit of revenue have done to art and artists throughout the 20th century and up to the modern day. From the printing press to live 2D, the artist has always been treated as a disposable physical asset, with little changing over time except the tightening of control and the creation of new methods to enforce it. In the last video, we talked about the ways the entertainment industry has used finance as a tool of control. And in this video, we're going to talk about what happens when money isn't enough control and companies standardize mistreating people, both physically and psychologically, in the pursuit of revenue. Pre-industrialization and the printing press. Since the very earliest days of mass entertainment, there have been reports of physical, psychological, and emotional abuse by authors and artists. The original right to copy protections were laid out in the 1557 Stationers' Royal Charter. This charter granted a full monopoly over all printing in the British Empire. This was the beginning of the chain of abuse creators have suffered for almost 500 years at the hands of those with the money or influence to put their work out into the world. Upon the endorsement of the Crown, the first fixers appeared. They were employed by the stationers to exercise the powers laid out in the charter, including seizing manuscripts and imprisoning authors to protect the publisher's investments. They also had what was called control of the copy, which meant publishers had full intellectual and economic rights, giving the author no recourse after what were called copy money buyouts, meaning a one-time payment by the publisher gave them exclusive rights to the printing of the author's work in perpetuity with no future residuals given. It goes so far back. Today I learned copyright didn't start out as protection for the artist or author. It started out as the protections the publishers had to copy the works. This isn't limited to authors, but talent and playwrights as well. Labeled as rogues and vagabonds to force them into service of aristocrats and lacking copy protection, people like Shakespeare were often left in benefit performance systems where they relied more on charity than on wages or proceeds from their work. The Vagabonds Act of 1572 was a law directly targeting the early acting troops and labeling them as rogues and vagabonds to try and force them into an aristocrat's court and subjugate them. These troops often depended on the money made from entertaining the towns and cities they would visit, but the shows took time to write and plan, and once a group has seen it, it made very little sense to stay where they were, as the returns would start to diminish. Being forced into the life of a court troupe would mean giving up the travel. It would lock the plays behind the gates of the court and limit the reach. Playwrights had it almost worse, as they weren't on stage, thus were pretty much unknown, and would have to depend on the talent to pay them from their payments. The first studio and its dark existence. When Edison employee William Kennedy Dixon created the kinetoscope, Edison was in need of content, so he went about building a machine to create it, and that machine was the Black Maria. So called because the entire inside and out were covered in a layer of tar paper for lighting reasons, as at the time film was very insensitive and required huge amounts of light to work. The Black Maria was not designed for comfort. It was described as a ghastly affair by Edison himself. The staff nicknamed the building the Doghouse due to its small size, but the name Black Maria stuck because it resembled the dark, narrow police paddy wagons, known colloquially as Black Marias, used to transport prisoners. This was an apt description, as it was a small, dark box, with the only ventilation being the entire roof being open directly to the sun, while the building rotated to keep the sun dead center of the camera aperture. The studio was covered in black tar paper and painted black. In the New Jersey summer, the temperatures could reach over 100 Fahrenheit while direct sunlight poured in on the performers. All this while competing with a building that was constantly moving, having to adjust equilibrium on the fly for filming. The lack of ventilation was documented when Annie Oakley filmed her shooting skills, and the cramped studio was so full of smoke they had to stop filming periodically to get the air clear enough to let the cameras see the action. As early orthochromatic film was incredibly light insensitive, the sunlight was the only effective light, as electric and lantern light would not suffice. This meant the talent had to deal with blinding glare, extreme temperature, and a cramped, unventilated, constantly moving workspace while constantly breathing the fumes from the heated tar coating the entire building. The darkness continued outside the studio. Under the Motion Pictures Patent Company, MPPC, also called the Edison Trust, we'll just call it the Trust, the discomfort continued outside of the studio and extended into the real world. It affected talent, other studios, and anyone who wanted to make moving pictures at the time. Founded in 1902 1908, the trust used intimidation, extortion, and violence to enforce Edison's patent protections, particularly against other startup studios. Some of the names that had run-ins with the trust were William Fox, who later founded Fox, and Carl Laemmle, who later founded Universal, and worked on some 400 movies. He won awards for his work, including an Oscar for All's Quiet on the Western Front in 1930, and being the first to use star power as a driver to get people into the theaters and encourage them to move away from the trust and to independent studios. One common practice was to raid other studios and destroy their equipment, with many reports of firing guns through the lenses in the front of the camera to destroy the mechanism. These organized fixers gangs would physically assault talent and crew that worked outside of the trust. This created an inhospitable environment to anyone outside of the Edison circle of trust and essentially shut down all competition on the East Coast. The Great Escape. Facing violence and the inability to work outside of an oppressive system that treated the talent and crew as disposable parts of a product that could simply be replaced, several people with investments and interest in the art of movies, and to a greater extent the potential future revenue of the medium, decided to find another place to start their studios. Far away from the external torment and limited shooting ability in New Jersey due to weather constraints and limited geographical differentiation, they set their sights on Southern California. San Francisco was already well established and had many amenities and services already in place. On paper, this makes sense when choosing a city. They had many talents to look at, but they had just had the fire, so the city was chaos and still in the process of rebuilding. San Diego was looked at by the trust, and Coronado was chosen, but didn't work, as at the time it was too remote with no train access and limited roads. Thus, it was less than desirable as a headquarters. When looking at Los Angeles, the studio saw an opportunity. It was a well-established city going through an extreme growth fueled by the oil industry and the multiple gold rushes that had happened in the last 50 or so years. There were also good roads and train access built by the oil companies, with a deep water port, and being so well located with access to so many varying geographies made it ideal for shooting, not to mention the dry air and harsh desert sun were good for the film and shooting quality. The Bay was a well-established city with well-established unions. San Diego was too remote, but LA was just right. It had all the amenities without any of that pesky oversight and meddling unions dictating things like fair treatment and wages. Thus, these companies were able to refine Edison's trust system of intimidation without much outside influence. This birthed the golden age of the Hollywood era, the golden age and the first Hollywood stars. California in the teens and 20s was still almost the remotest part of the country. Lots of oil in mines and dust and sun, and they had money, but they were still the middle of nowhere. A few others saw an opportunity where they could go and make art and share it with the world, or they could go and be unsupervised while building human-powered meat grinders so far out of reach of the government it will take decades for anyone to do anything about it. The first integrated studio. We've talked a bit about the Big Five before in these videos. Now we know why they ended up in California. The first to flee was Paramount. Originally founded as the Famous Players Company in 1912 by Adolf Zucker in New York. Just a year later, in 1913, in Los Angeles, three men who wanted to make movies together without the interference of the trust rented the barn and started filming movies on their own terms. You may recognize his partner's name being Cecil B. DeMille and Samuel Goldfish. The feature play company, as it was known, had made a deal with W. Hodgkin's Paramount Pictures, which was just a distribution company at the time, and were willing to work outside the trust. As Paramount was willing to work outside the trust, it only made sense for Zucker a year later in 1914 to make a distribution deal with them as well. It wasn't long before Zucker realized that the real power was in the distribution of the product, and the theater bottleneck was where the real control was. Paramount had that control. By 1915, Zucker had been using intermediaries and cutouts to purchase large amounts of Paramount stock, and in June 1916 staged a coup at a board meeting by using his new majority vote to relieve Hodgkinson of his company, laying control at the feet of Zucker. Within 6 days, the merger of the Famous Players Company and the Feature Play Company to form Famous Players Lasky Corporation, not officially taking the name Paramount until 1927, with Lasky in charge of operations in California and Zucker as the head of the company in New York. After the merge, Goldwyn and Zucker clashed, and Goldwyn took a large payout that later helped found Goldwyn Studios, one of the three that later merged to become MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. And Cecil B. DeMille became the biggest director at Paramount until he passed away in 1959 after making The Ten Commandments. This was the first fully integrated studio. From talent and crew to theater seats, they owned it all. The rest of the Cartel joined. Over the course of the next 20 years, the other members of the Cartel would be founded or created through merger and acquisition, starting with Warner Brothers. Founded in 1903 in Pennsylvania with a small Nickelodeon, they battled the trust for years, ultimately deciding to move operations to California on Sunset Boulevard in 1918 and fully incorporating in 1923. They were followed by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, originally three companies from the East Coast that merged in 1924 and settled in Culver City. In 1928, a man named David Sarnoff, through boardroom moves in New York, created RKO. By merging a theater chain he had an interest in and a film booking office that already owned studio space in Hollywood. Fox was an interesting story, and William Fox started out in New York and New Jersey and defeated the trust in an antitrust lawsuit in 1915, but later merged with 20th Century Films to form 20th Century Fox and moved operations to Century City in 1935. There was also what was called the Little Three. They consisted of Universal, United Artists, and Columbia. They may not have had the full integration of the Big Five, but they were fully compliant in the system as it was. The head of Columbia, Harry Cohn, was said to have ran his studio based on a culture of fear and intimidation inspired by Mussolini, the Golden System. We talked a little bit about contracts in the first video, and the financial manipulation in play at the studios during this period in the second video. Now we'll talk about the studio system, the way they colluded to use their integrated model and cartel-like mentality to corner artists and get their desired goals at the cost of the people involved. The cartel had made agreements amongst each other, as we talked about in the second video. They weren't really in competition, they just wanted a better yacht than their competition. These agreements included what was called a no-poaching policy. Once a talent's 7-year contract was done, they could end up blackballed. If the studio they were with decided they were difficult or wanted them to renew with them, this meant no other studio would hire them either, effectively ending their career. One of the most egregious cases was an actress named Louise Rayner. She worked for MGM and was the first talent to win multiple Academy Awards, and the first to win back-to-back in 1936 and 37, but complained about working conditions and hours and was released from her contract with Louis B. Mayer stating, "We made you and we are going to destroy you." Complaints of working conditions were common, which made it a common reason for suspension or being loaned out. These are different. Human arbitrage and humiliation. One time, Clark Gable was loaned out to Columbia Studio to film It Happened One Night in 1934 as a humiliation because he complained about the working conditions at MGM. The studio charged a large sum for his participation, and as Mr. Gable was on a contract, he received no added pay. He proceeded to win an Academy Award for the role. This system wasn't just used as punishment, but as another way to monetize the talent by paying their base salary while charging the other studios a premium and taking the difference. This happened to many of the great names in the studio system, including Clark Gable as mentioned, but also Humphrey Bogart. In 1947, Humphrey Bogart, working for Warner Brothers, was loaned out to Columbia Pictures to do the movie Dead Reckoning. This was punitive. Bogart frequently refused terrible scripts, was often suspended without pay. They then loaned him out as punishment. Ingrid Bergman. In 1942, Ingrid Bergman was loaned out from Selznick International to Warner Brothers for Casablanca. This was Arbitrage. David O. Selznick paid Bergman her contracted $3,000 per week, but charged Warner Brothers a flat fee of $114,000 for her labor, pocketing the massive surplus. Olivia de Havilland. Olivia de Havilland, in 1939, was working for Warner Brothers and was loaned to Selznick International for Gone with the Wind. This was human trade. She was traded to Selznick as part of a barter deal. She later sued Warner Brothers over the suspension extensions used to trap talent in these contracts. Betty Davis. In 1934, Betty Davis was loaned out to Warner Brothers from RKO Pictures to do the movie Of Human Bondage. This was partially arbitrage, partially disciplinary. Warner loaned her out assuming the ugly role would ruin her marketability. She received critical acclaim instead, though Warner Brothers pocketed the loan premium. Gene Kelly. In 1944, Gene Kelly was working for MGM Studios and was loaned out to Columbia Pictures to do the movie CoverGirl. This was arbitrage. MGM did not yet see his value and rented him out for a profit. Columbia ended up making him a massive star. Vivian Lee. In 1940, Vivian Lee was working for Selznick International and was loaned out to MGM to do the movie Waterloo Bridge. Selznick rented her out strictly to generate liquid capital for his own studio operations. Janet Leigh. In 1958, Janet Leigh was working for Selznick International and was loaned out to Universal Pictures to do the movie Touch of Evil. This was pure arbitrage again. Selznick literally sold her contract to Universal to pay off his own mounting studio debts. Cary Grant. In 1937, Cary Grant, working for Paramount Pictures, was loaned out to Columbia Pictures to do The Awful Truth. This was another case of arbitrage. The treatment during this loan-out drove Grant to refuse to renew his contract, becoming the first major star to pioneer the independent freelance contract model to escape studio ownership. Levels of penitence. We talked about suspension in the last video. A talent would be forced into 7-year contracts. When these suspensions were levied against talent, they were not allowed to work outside their studio and would receive no pay while suspended, with the contract effectively paused and that time not counting against their contract time out. They would be unemployed without the ability to work due to their contract terms. There are many well-documented instances of major players being suspended. Bette Davis. Suspended in 1936 for refusing assigned scripts, Davis fled to the United Kingdom to work independently. Warner Brothers secured a British court injunction against her. The negative effect was the total depletion of her finances via international legal fees, the loss of the lawsuit, and the forced return to the studio under the original coercive contract. Rita Hayworth. Suspended repeatedly by studio head Harry Cohn for refusing scripts and for personal relationship choices. The negative effect was the immediate punitive cessation of her salary, which created severe financial precarity and enforced her dependency on a studio head who actively subjected her to psychological and physical abuse, including surveillance. Humphrey Bogart. Suspended 11 separate times by Jack Warner for script refusal. The negative effect was the compounded loss of base income and the psychological toll of the punishment roles assigned upon his return. To break his morale post-suspension, Warner forced Bogart into humiliating projects, such as playing a wrestling promoter in Swing Your Lady in 1938. Louise Rayner. Suspended by Louis B. Mayer shortly after winning consecutive Academy Awards in 36 and 37. Due to her demands for better working conditions and script approval, the negative effect was the systemic destruction of her American film career. Mayer utilized the studio Cartel's no poaching agreement to enforce an industry-wide blackball, ensuring she could not secure employment at any other major studio. And the most famous of this era was Olivia de Havilland, suspended multiple times in the early 40s for refusing repetitive stereotypical roles. Because suspension time was added to the end of the standard 7-year contract, her term was indefinitely extended. The negative effect was zero income, forced unemployment, and an industry-wide blackballing that lasted over 2 years while she litigated the contract, ultimately resulting in the 1944 de Havilland ruling, ending the practice of extending contracts through suspension. The real Dr. Feelgood. The studios didn't just limit the abuse to contract manipulation, reputational damage, and emotional abuse, including forced isolation. They took it to the next level with the help of the medical community. Enter Dr. Feelgood. Real name Dr. Max Jacobson or Dr. Robert Fryman, or any number of other anonymous Hollywood independent doctors, depending on the era. MGM went so far as to have their own medical facility on the property. Publicly, these companies kept staff doctors for the health of the talent, including administering these classics: vitamin B12 injections, amphetamines, dietary supplements, also amphetamines, energy boosters, Benzatrine, sleeping aids, barbiturates, Seconal or Nembutal were common. These doctors did as they were paid to do quietly. Forced addiction and pharmaceutical aids were common vectors of studio control. For larger procedures, apart from MGM, who had their own facility, Cedars of Lebanon Hospital, a prominent medical facility in Los Angeles that operated from 1930 until 1976, was a frequent, discreet facility used by studio fixers, where physicians would perform off-the-books procedures. It was merged with Mount Sinai Hospital to form Cedars-Sinai Hospital in 1961, but the original location operated until 1976, and Cedars-Sinai still functions as the go-to hospital for the studios as they exist today. Do no harm. Talent in this period would often suffer nervous collapses or exhaustion, but these were usually euphemisms for overdoses or mental breaks due to the most common medical intervention, which was pharmaceutical. These regimens usually consisted of daily Benzatrine to keep the energy level up for 18 to 72 hour shooting schedules, and barbiturates to sleep at night, all provided by real doctors in a discreet manner. Both Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney were put on these regimens as young as 13 or 14 14 years old. Later, this caused Judy Garland to have several mental breaks, including making attempts on her own life multiple times. Ultimately, these issues led to her passing at 47 of an overdose. This was always reported in the news as nervous exhaustion or nervous collapse. This pattern continued into the 50s, with Marilyn Monroe missing days on set due to exhaustion or viral infection, but it is widely documented that at the time she was fighting a debilitating barbiturate addiction. Other common reasons for a star's absences include emergency appendectomy, the more common name for a forced undocumented termination of a pregnancy. This was viewed more by the studio as a form of production maintenance. This wasn't a medical procedure, it was asset management, and the talent in the hospital for a couple of days is better than one-off set for maternity. Rest cure / sanatorium retreat. Rehab, covert pregnancy, or forced isolation, used to explain extended substance rehabilitation, secret pregnancy and birth, or just isolation as punishment for being difficult. The companies could bypass any legal process, as they would suggest the rest, and if the talent didn't do it, they would have their career destroyed. This made it voluntary. If they were underage, part of the contract was that they were given a legal guardian by the studio, more to protect the asset than to keep the child from harm. The most well-documented of these cases was Loretta Young, when in 1935, as a result of, by what all accounts, was an unwanted encounter on a date probably set up by the studio with a married Clark Gable, became pregnant. To avoid a career-ending scandal, the studio announced she was suffering from a mysterious long-term illness requiring a rest cure and sent her to Europe, and later to isolation in a secluded house. Young hid the pregnancy, gave birth secretly, placed the child in an orphanage, and then adopted her own biological daughter months later. The rest cure was just the coordinated press cover for the entire ordeal. This was confirmed much later by that daughter, Judy Lewis. Intestinal infection, food poisoning, used to obscure recovery from the procedures, as well as recovery from accidental overdose on studio lots and just plain being too hungover to appear. This one is hard to track as it was intentionally vague and common, so tracking it would be a whole other video and maybe a bit granular for a video of this scope. The Oscar-shaped hammer. The thing that kept all this running was a small organization called AMPAS, or the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. They're still around. They're known just as the Academy or the Oscars. They were started by MGM studio head Louis B. Mayer when the crew members started unionizing, starting with carpenters, painters, and electricians. The fear of the talent unionizing became real, so to head it off, the studio created its own exclusive club, euphemistically called the Academy. It was separated into sections for talent, directors, writers, technicians, and producers. This was essentially a company union. It appeared like the talent had a vote, and it was all very democratic, but being a member of the Academy kept the talent from going outside the system for any disputes or grievances. At the end of the day, it was all controlled by the studio heads, and they made the final decisions. The prestige afforded. As a member of the Academy, you were eligible to work at any studio as long as you had a contract. All your movies were eligible for Oscars, and you got to work alongside some of the greatest talents in movie history. What you really got: the Academy contract. The Academy negotiated all contracts and standardized them at 7 years. Work hours. The Academy standardized a 54 to 72 hour work week for talent, no overtime. The Academy standard contract explicitly stated no overtime regardless of time on set. Binding arbitration. The Academy contracts forced talent to go through arbitration, which was run by the studios themselves. These long hours and the requirement to be on set for up to 18 hours a day were the cause of the previously mentioned medical issues and the reason the studios needed the on-call medical advisors. This all fell apart in March 1933 when the Academy agreed, without members' consent, to a 50% pay cut for all members. This triggered a mass exodus and led to the founding of the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild. Between that and the 44 de Havilland ruling, which stopped the practice of extended contracts through suspension, and the 1948 Paramount decision, which broke up the integration of theaters into the studios, pretty much broke the back of the system. But there is always someone trying to exploit talent, and in the 50s, it was music's turn. The movies ended, the music started. While the movie industry was slowly collapsing in the early 50s, another group took note, both of where they failed failed, but also how they worked and what changes needed to be made to keep the system going and refine it for a whole other industry. We talked about how these companies came together in the last video, so we won't spend too much time on that here. But the Big Six had learned and refined the methods of abuse. The advantage the music companies figured out was twofold: open-ended contracts that could in theory be extended forever, and the recoupable advance system we detailed in the last video. Between these two factors, these companies were able to innovate in new and amazing ways to financially exploit talent, but the real bonus was the emotional and psychological abuse that could be inflicted on talent that is indefinitely in debt and under a contract that could never end. As these companies each had their own special methods, we will break them down into four main categories and just give real examples of what talent would go through for fame: physical coercion and medical neglect, total isolation and psychological imprisonment, creative withholding and psychological trapping, media smearing, and reputational damage. The smaller companies that would come into existence after the war and later got swallowed up would start the abuse and create the methods that would later be refined by the Big Six. The Big Six were doing the racism. One of the things we didn't talk about was the Big Six and the aggressive racism prevalent in their business practices. The cover song containment strategy. Instead of booking their black R&B artists into mainstream venues or pushing them to pop radio, major labels actively suppressed the original recordings, labeling them as race records. They utilized white artists on their rosters such as Elvis Presley and Pat Boone to record sanitized covers of songs written by black artists like Little Richard and Big Mama Thornton. The labels deployed a massive promotional budget to push the white artists into large crossover venues, intentionally trapping the originator on the low-paying Chitlin circuit. The psychological toll of this identity erasure was profound. It was being told your music was good enough, but you were not. The Big Six also maintained segregation within their A&R and promotional departments. Black artists were signed to race labels, later rhythm and blues divisions. The rule within the Big Six was R&B promotional budgets were a fraction of pop budgets. Label booking agents and PR departments explicitly refused to pitch these artists to major crossover venues, enforcing a rigid demographic glass ceiling to appease white promoters. Some of these artists are from before the Big Six, but the labels got swallowed up or bought up, and the abuse they committed and systemized became standard operating procedure for decades to come. Physical coercion and medical neglect. Jackie Wilson. From his 1957 break into the music scene, Jackie Wilson was subjected to a near continuous touring cycle for approximately 18 years, until his onstage collapse in September of 1975. His manager would withhold or mismanage his money, including not paying his taxes, which caused Mr. Wilson to become indebted to the IRS and his management company, thus the need to perpetually tour and generate liquid assets to serve that debt. He never woke up from that 1975 collapse and eventually passed after an almost 9-year coma in 1984. This was the direct result of the constant physically grueling touring schedule and the lack of medical care for his known cardiovascular issues. Ruth Brown. Such a prolific artist in the early 50s, Atlantic Records was known as the house that Ruth built. In truth, in 1949, on the way to one of her first big performances, Miss Brown was in a car accident and shattered both of her legs. This left her in a body cast for 9 months, during which time the label paid for all of her medical expenses through recoupable advances, meaning they would get every penny back from the 5% royalty she negotiated in her contract. This meant as soon as she was recovered, she was forced on tour and had to remain there due to that debt, 300 days a year average for 20 years. All along in massive pain and dealing with the Jim Crow South segregated Chitlin circuit, as it was called. By the early 60s, Miss Brown's body was giving out, and the psychological toll of being in pain and on tour that long, paired with changing tastes in music, caused Atlantic to drop her from the label. She spent the rest of her life working in Long Island as a domestic servant, bus driver, and teacher's aide before passing away in 2006 of a heart attack, never really getting what she earned. Chess Records. The famous Cadillac Records of Chicago, home to some of the biggest names in music, including Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, and Etta James. We're going to focus on Etta James as a case study of how the talent was treated. Miss James was an amazing singer when she was discovered in 1954. 6 years later, in 1960, her contract was purchased by Chess Records. Within a year, Miss James had been introduced to heroin and been surrounded by, as she said in her autobiography, addicts, pimps, and fellow musicians that normalized drug use. The label facilitated this habit by not paying royalties, instead giving physical assets like Cadillacs and off-the-books cash advances that provided instant liquid capital for illicit purchases, while also paying for discreet rehab and bail, all while ignoring the physical breakdown of the person as long as she kept making hits. Bo Diddley. widely credited as the foundational creator of rock and roll. He was in perpetual debt to the label and had to continuously tour into his 70s. Incapable of stopping to seek proper medical attention, he suffered multiple strokes and heart failure while on the road. Little Walter, one of the greatest harmonica players possibly ever, was also a severe alcoholic with violent tendencies when drinking. The label turned a blind eye to the obvious problems until he was assaulted in a street fight and passed away at the age of 37. Muddy Waters, widely held up as the ultimate bluesman, credited with helping bring the blues to audiences of any sort, not just mainstream, was in so much debt to the studio he lived in constant fear of destitution, to the point he would do physical labor for the label to help pay off his debts. The humiliation of being a foundational artist of an entire genre and to be painting walls for money would weigh on anyone's psyche. Chuck Berry, so horribly mistreated by his label, he ended up with permanent paranoia and trauma response. The theft of his intellectual property through adding and changing credit on his works early in his career led him to refusing to travel with others, refusing to sign any standard contract, and even refusing to play before he was paid in full, in cash, in a brown paper bag. His long-term mental health and trust issues are the direct result of the abuse suffered at the hands of Chess Records. The Beatles. Before they were the Beatles, they were four guys trapped in Hamburg, Germany, doing 8 to 12-hour sets while under threat of being deported and kept on Preludin to keep them playing. They were later supplied Dexedrine by their label to keep up the touring schedule for the Beatlemania marketing machine. This helped establish the later dependencies that would eventually destroy the band and have long-lasting impacts on all members. Tina Turner. Her husband and manager, Ike Turner, controlled her through extreme violence and intimidation, forcing her to tour relentlessly while suffering perpetual industries for almost a decade. These included broken ribs, a broken jaw, third-degree burns, and acute, untreated illnesses just to maintain control. The rest of the industry promoters, executives, and other acts on the tour knew what was happening and did nothing as long as the hits kept coming. Once these smaller labels finally got swallowed up or sold their contracts and libraries to the Big Six, the methods were just adopted and refined. And as was mentioned with the Beatles, it wasn't just small artists that were treated like products and forced into unfair, unsafe working conditions. Total isolation and psychological imprisonment. The Shangri-Las, a wildly successful group created in 1964, had 12 charting hits between 1964 and 1966, including their #1 hit, Leader of the Pack. They were created in 1963 when two pairs of sisters in their early teens, between 14 and 16, started performing at school and talent shows. They were signed by Redbird Records in 1964, when the youngest, Mary, was 15 and the eldest, Betty, was 17. From that point on, they were basically prisoners, routinely being the subject of threats, including guns being openly displayed during recording sessions and negotiations, being forced to tour without proper supervision or security, to the point that a 16-year-old Mary felt it necessary to carry a handgun to guard the hotel room doors so her group mates could sleep. The mental stresses were so heavy and the environment so unsafe, they disbanded in 1968. They all pretty much never came back to music due to many reasons, including legal. Apart from Mary Ann Ganser, one of the twins who fell into addiction after the trauma of her music career and passed away due to an overdose at just 22 in 1970, leaving her twin sister behind, the group seems to have lived normal lives. Ronnie Spector. Ronnie met Phil in 1963 when he signed her and the Ronettes to his label, Phillies Records, to start his Wall of Sound empire. Phil Spector was a special kind of monster, but not unique. He started early, isolating Ronnie from her family and bandmates systematically until 1968. That's when he married and subsequently imprisoned her in a 26-room mansion in Beverly Hills. He would take her shoes so she couldn't leave past the barbed wire and guard dogs. There was audio surveillance in every room of the compound, and Ronnie was no longer allowed to perform or record music. Phil had a golden glass coffin installed in the basement and would tell her if she tried to leave, he would kill her and display her body in it. 4 years later, barefoot, with the help of her mother, she was able to escape, but spent the rest of her life being victimized by the monster. He had written the contract in such a way that in 1988, when Ronnie and the Ronettes sued him for $10 million in unpaid royalties, initially the court sided with them. But later, a New York appeals court overturned the decision in 2000, saying the contract was too ironclad to be overturned. A year later, Spector would be arrested and eventually convicted of the murder of actress Lana Clarkson. Brian Wilson. The Beach Boys were the originators of surf rock, largely due to the creative production and writing of Brian Wilson, but he was always known to be an emotional and erratic person. In 1975, when his mental issues became too much for his family and label to deal with, a Dr. Landy was brought in to treat him and seemed to help, ending his treatments in 1976. But by 1982, Mr. Wilson had fallen into a severe depression and addictive state. Landy was brought back in by the label and his family for treatment to get Mr. Wilson viable. Landy at that point misdiagnosed Mr. Wilson with paranoid schizophrenia and began an extreme regimen of antipsychotics, including heavy doses of Navan, which is called a typical antipsychotic, or first gen. In proper dosage to a person with a disorder that it will treat, it is an effective medication, although highly regulated. In someone who doesn't need it and at high dosage, it can cause confusion and drowsiness, creating a docile and compliant state. This was in concert with strict isolation and security details, including control over eating habits, monitoring of phone calls, and complete separation from his family and band. Witnesses and family members during the late 1980s noted that Mr. Wilson was over-medicated into near non-existence. Landy took advantage of this position, putting himself on Mr. Wilson's recording credits as writer or producer to siphon residuals from his work. He also named himself Mr. Wilson's business manager and took a staggering 25% of all Mr. Wilson's income during this time. After many years of litigation, in 1992, Mr. Wilson was given a permanent restraining order against Landy. As far as can be found, the only repercussions to Landy was the revocation of his license and to get to retire with millions of dollars he got through unethical means while destroying a man and his family. Mariah Carey. Tommy Mottola, the CEO of Sony Records, took an interest in the 18-year-old Mariah Carey when she was signed. Within 5 years, he had gone from controlling every aspect of her career to marrying her and taking control of her entire life. Mottola used corporate assets to build a 50-acre compound in Bedford, New Jersey, where Carey was virtually imprisoned, with armed guards hired to track and control her movements. As with Ronnie Spector, the compound was completely wired for surveillance, and all phone lines were tapped and monitored. If Carey left the compound for any reason, she was accompanied by security, and if she attempted to leave without permission, security would be sent out to intercept her. Mottola justified the domestic imprisonment as protection of the brand. He forced her to dress a certain way and controlled her actions in public. He also actively sabotaged her artistic growth by using his power within Sony to threaten to kill her marketing budget or not release her music. To finally escape, Carey had to plan for months, hiding a go bag on the property and eventually taking a window of opportunity to physically escape the compound in 1997. She retreated to a private hotel in Manhattan with her own hired security to prevent Mottola's thugs from retrieving her. This didn't end the torture and the exercise of control from Mottola, as he spent years undermining her independent career, going so far as to find out what sample she was using and pushing the production through using the same sample to undermine her releases. This cycle has continued into the modern era, with the most notable in recent memory being Amy Winehouse, Britney Spears, Liam Payne, Aaron Carter, and Avicii. That's it, right? The music industry was so much less regulated than the movie industry that the abuse was far deeper and so much more hidden. If you have a favorite artist from a major label, they were abused by the label in some way, 99% of the time. This marks the halfway point for music abuses. This one's a bit longer than the financial. Financial's generally a kind of uniform abuse across the board. This stuff is so nuanced and manifests in so many ways, I felt I had to touch on all the most egregious cases to make point. Thanks for watching. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope I'm earning your subscription. The rest of this part isn't quite so traumatic. Creative withholding and psychological trapping. As an unintended consequence of the 1944 de Havilland ruling, which made long-binding contracts illegal, the music industry had decided no timelines, just deliverables. At some point in the 70s, someone at a label figured out that they could keep an artist signed indefinitely and not have to worry about them overtaking new investments or going to another label. They did this by writing contracts with ownership clauses, including that the label owned the masters, therefore even if the artist did leave, they didn't control their music. A couple of the more famous cases from the early era of this were John Fogerty. When he left his label, he lost control of all the masters to his greatest hits, and when he went to release new music, he was sued by his former label because his new music sounded too much like his old music. This left him with such trauma he refused to play his own hits for more than 20 years and pretty much ended his productive era in music. Tom Petty. In 1979, MCA bought out the label Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were signed to, without the knowledge of the band. Mr. Petty made a statement publicly rejecting the trade and being bought and sold like a piece of meat, rejecting the chattel trading of artists. This caused MCA MCA to refuse to renegotiate his contract. As a result, Mr. Petty and his band, along with their producer, Jimmy Iovine, used private studios and their own money to record the next album, all while physically hiding the master tapes so MCA Records couldn't attempt to confiscate the physical media. To break the contract, Mr. Petty had to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. MCA retaliated through legal and psychological means, suing for breach of contract and threatening to sabotage opportunities for the band within the industry. It took a full year of legal and mental games for Mr. Petty to finally be free from the label, and many years more to recover from the mental traumas inflicted. George Michael, one of the most prolific hitmakers of the 80s with Wham, and then as a solo artist, Mr. Michael wanted to take more control over his image and stop promoting his hypersexualized persona. Sony, being worried about the bottom line and concerned that if Mr. Michael's image changed, the next album would not make as much as the previous, decided to go to war with the artist. The label flat out refused to promote his follow-up, which caused it to underperform on the charts and caused Mr. Michael to owe even more due to recoupable advances incurred during production. Unable to work due to label hindrance and paralyzed by depression, this ended in a very public lawsuit with Mr. Michael labeling the situation professional slavery. Prince, possibly the most famous of these cases from the same era as the George Michael lawsuit, Prince was one of the greatest musicians and songwriters of his era and possibly in history. The string of hits written for himself and other artists would take a whole video to list. His list of awards is at least as impressive. 7 Grammys, 7 Brit Awards, 6 American Music Awards, 4 MTV VMAs, an Oscar, a Golden Globe, 2 albums in the Grammy Hall of Fame, President's Merit Award, American Music Award of Achievement, American Music Award of Merit, a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Purple Rain was added to the Library of Congress, and in 2025 he received a posthumous Grammy Life Achievement Award. Prince was so prolific in his production that he asked the label to speed the release schedule of his music. The label refused as it wanted to prevent market saturation. As a result, he changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol and began appearing in public with the word slave written on his cheeks. Eventually, he relented and fulfilled his contract by submitting 2 completed albums to the label. He was immediately released from his contract and promptly released another competing album in 1996. The years of high-intensity touring and high output had put a strain on his body and mind. Prince had been living under an addiction to Vicodin and Percocet for years as a relief from the skeletal-level pain, eventually having to procure the medication through street-level illicit connections, which led to him passing of an overdose from counterfeit fentanyl-laced Vicodin in 2016. Media smearing and reputational destruction. Let's talk a bit about what labels did to their own artists when they didn't want to cooperate with the company. The story of Tommy Mottola using his pull to try and sabotage Mariah Carey after she left him and Sony is not isolated, and others went through that and worse after they displeased their label. Harry Belafonte, the first solo artist ever to get a platinum record in 1956. Mr. Belafonte used his platform and finances to support the burgeoning civil rights movement. This caused him to fall afoul of the government and particularly the FBI. The FBI put pressure on his label to drop him and facilitated the blackballing for much of the 50s and early 60s. He was also subjected to intense surveillance and investigation by the McCarthy Anti-Communist Committee. Florence Ballard, founding member and original lead singer of the Supremes, was unhappy that Berry Gordy had been pushing Diana Ross as the face of the Supremes and felt marginalized. This led to direct conflict with the label, and in July 1967, Berry Gordy terminated her contract and the label began to systematically slander Miss Ballard in the industry and public, labeling her unprofessional, overweight, and a hopeless alcoholic. Motown and Gordy actively blocked the attempts to establish a solo career by refusing to work with labels that worked with her. She was effectively frozen out of the industry and eventually ended up on public aid to feed her children. Severe depression and poverty contributed to her early death in 1976 at just 32 years old. Nina Simone. As Miss Simone matured in her artistic outlook, she began shifting her output to be more explicitly supportive of the civil rights movement. This resulted in a similar backlash to Mr. Belafonte's move 10 years earlier to support the civil rights movement at its beginnings. Radio stations began boycotting her music and her label, actively working to keep her from working, spreading the narrative that she was angry, unstable, and dangerous. This destroyed her radio play and touring career in the United States. By the early 70s, she had put herself into exile, living in places including Liberia and Norway, before settling in southern France, never to return to the United States except for tours and special concert events. Sinead O'Connor. As a chart-topping artist in the late 80s and early 90s, Miss O'Connor used her platform to protest injustices in the world that she thought were important, including refusing to sing the American national anthem at her own concerts in 1990, and her eventual tearing up of a photo of the Pope at an SNL appearance in 1992. At that point, the industry and her label completely abandoned her. Industry and media figures portrayed her as insane. Frank Sinatra openly threatened her with physical violence, and the industry wholeheartedly supported that stance. Within weeks, she was booed off stage at a Bob Dylan tribute concert, and her career was effectively over. The long-term effects to Miss O'Connor's mental health and her career viability are still felt to this day. The Dixie Chicks. The Chicks, or reasons. In early 2003, one of the members of the Dixie Chicks, an extremely popular country bluegrass group from Texas, made a comment criticizing the US president at the time. The immediate backlash was utterly ruthless. Two major radio conglomerates immediately banned their music from all stations, Cumulus Media and Clear Channel, now iHeart. Radio morning shows had CD burning parties for their music, and it took 4 years for them to recover their careers in any meaningful way within the United States. This was partly a genuine backlash and the first modern instance of the industry and government actively working to silence a perceived activist voice from within. The band was subjected to severe psychological distress along with credible security threats. It was also a warning to other artists that it doesn't matter how big an artist is, they will destroy your career and their own revenue for political allegiance. J and K-pop are so much worse. Agencies took all this and made it their model. They depersonalized the talent while creating an artificial personal connection to be exploited and drive revenue. The mental trauma inflicted on the talent is dehumanizing and devastating, all while controlling them through layers of predatory practices, psychological and financial. Johnny refined the torture. As we talked about in the previous video, Johnny Kitagawa started refining his J-pop model as soon as the late 60s, recruiting younger and younger talent into the industry. But he was insidious, as he used the abuse as a tool rather than ad hoc or as reactionary. The systemic, structured, mental and physical exploitation was part of the model from the beginning. It was planned. The Yosujo system, created in the 1970s, was specifically created to make talent psychologically dependent on the agency, creating a codependency that would make them unable to function in a normal life. In 1986, Okada Yukiko, an artist managed by Sun Music, took her own life in the agency's headquarters after a highly publicized personal crisis. This triggered Yukiko syndrome, where the parasocial bonds created by the industry were on full display. Fans were copycatting her actions. The industry response was not to change the system, just to tighten control of media contact, image management, and include media blackouts as standard procedure. This showed the true interest of the agencies to be revenue and not the safety of the talent. Financial torture is mental torture too. The J and K-pop agencies have taken the Big Six recoupment model to a whole new level. They recruit kids as young as 10 years old, then start invoicing them for everything. Voice lessons, dance training, housing, food, mandatory aesthetic procedures. That's exactly what it sounds like. With the Big Six, you were only in debt for recording costs and business expenses. In the idol model, you are in debt for your existence. You begin your career owing the company tens of thousands of dollars for the privilege of having been trained. It creates a perpetual state of debt where the artist must be a massive global hit just to reach a zero balance. Highlighted by the case of Hallyu, a K-pop group managed by SM Entertainment, who took the agency to court to nullify their slave contract. This contract spanned 13 years and left them with almost no profit to show from it. This exposed the model to the public, and the court's finding resulted in a similar ruling to the 1946 de Havilland ruling, limiting contract terms for agencies to 7 years. It did nothing to end or even slow down the recoupment practice. As recently as 2022, a member of the K-pop group Luna, named Chu, was terminated from the group on allegations that could not be corroborated, including abusive language and power trips. This is also the classic use of reputational smearing. As of the time of writing, Chu has won her legal matter with Luna's parent company, BlackBerry. Unfortunately, the rest of the group has encountered legal issues, including actions from the agency and injunctions from the court. Contractual Aesthetics. J-pop and K-pop contracts always include aesthetic clauses. These include medical and dental procedures. Agencies operate dedicated monitoring squads. These track trainee weight, calorie intake, and skin condition. They live with controlled diets, exercise regimens, and schedules for every part of their existence, including sleep schedules. Unmet goals can result in punishment diets, or mandatory leave for surgical corrections. They have successfully commodified the body to the point where the agencies manage the biochemistry of the talent to ensure the visual remains consistent with the product specifications. The modern innovations. In Korea, agencies classify idols as partners rather than employees, exempting the agency from labor protections. In Japan, Article 230 allows companies to pursue stringent legal action against those that make allegations for disruption of business. By framing any disclosure of mistreatment as defamation of the corporate brand, agencies effectively use the legal system to enforce silence. This is government-backed DARVO. VTuber agencies are the conclusion. VTuber agencies have taken all these things we've spoken about in the previous two videos to a whole new level. With the ability to control the image and the art, they have almost completely taken the human element out, the last bug in the system that has been being built for the 500 years. The ability to keep talent in complete anonymity while still making constant personal appearances through live streaming almost daily. This allows the agencies to exercise extreme control. Without outside interference as part of the VTuber world is anonymity, so talent can be truly isolated from their fans and agency mates. As we spoke about in the last video concerning the VShojo situation, this was a tool they used to confuse and obfuscate the financial impropriety. By causing internal strife and confusion, Gunrun was able to play the shell game much longer than he may have been able to in a more traditional industry. Harassment-Driven Displacement. In March of 2020, a VTuber debuted under the VOMS agency, a mid-level agency with a spotty past of scandals and talent mistreatment. Pikami was immediately successful. With her cute model and personable, friendly, and innocent personality, she connected with an audience quickly and soon became VOM's biggest revenue generator. In February 2023, Pikami expressed on stream her interest in playing Hogwarts Legacy. She knew nothing of the controversies happening in other parts of the world, as they were not widely reported in the Japanese media. The result was a massive backlash, including online bullying and an organized harassment campaign against her. VOMs did nothing to stop, abate, or even defend their biggest talent. The lack of defense or even support from her company and the harassment became too much, and she was forced to graduate a little more than a month later, only to debut under the VShojo banner as Henya the Genius. This illustrated that the company will not protect talent if they deem it more financially viable to just terminate the talent and sweep the problem under the rug. VOM survived, but lost its primary revenue driver and has limped along ever since. Identity, Erasure, and Reincarnation as escape. In 2011, a game called Go-Go Nippon, My First Trip to Japan released. It featured two sisters, Misaki Akira and Misaki Makoto, guiding you through Japan as a foreign tourist. It was developed by Overdrive and published by Manga Gamer. 10 years later, at the height of the global pandemic, and in the midst of the VTuber sphere exploding, Manga Gamer wanted to capitalize on the new market with an already established IP in their portfolio, and Go-Go Nippon Live Broadcasting was launched. They cast the twins to reprise their original roles as Akira and Makoto from the decade-old game and become VTubers. This was a highly successful venture for the twins, showing them the world of VTubing, and they were able to generate a large fan base through hard work and managed to revive a long-dormant property. On the corporate side, it wasn't as successful as hoped, and in November of that same year, the finances ran out and the plug was pulled on the project. Akira and Makoto were forced to graduate and their IPs were reclaimed by the company while the people were thrown away. This brings us to the rebirth model. With their IP stripped and the cost of new art, models, and rigging being driven up by the larger agencies, as we talked about in the second video, the twins were forced to seek out another agency that could help them acquire assets and market their new personas. In steps Wactor. They operated on an oppressive management model characterized by restrictive conditions, withheld payments, and retaliatory tactics. This included publicly doxing their own talent if they stepped out of line. What began as a necessary compromise to obtain new models turned into a deeply toxic corporate trap. After enduring severe contract disputes and an unlivable psychological environment, the twins managed to sever ties with Wactor. This required going through the rebirth cycle again, losing their IP and essentially starting from scratch. Within months, they were able to sign with Hololive, one of the biggest agencies in the industry. This means much better support and many more layers of defense, but it also means they are forced to toe the company line. They are in the same position as before, just with more resources and support, until they part ways and lose everything, which they will. They are, for all intents and purposes, still trapped and doomed to repeat the cycle. Institutional mobbing. A former indie that made the move to a large agency debuted. Her name was Selen Tatsuki. Having already been a VTuber with an established following and a level learning curve, Selene quickly became Nijisanji N's biggest, most profitable performer. But behind the scenes, things were not going as well as on the surface. Selene had constant fights with the agency over bureaucracy, out-of-pocket project costs, and lack of management support. This all came to a head with a well-documented situation in which Selene self-funded a music video and it was blocked by the agency. Between the behind-the-scenes psychological abuse and the outright blocking of Selene's work, she ended up attempting to take her own life. The company did everything they could to smear her and destroy her reputation, going so far as to use other talents, Alira Pandora, Vox Akuma, and Ike Eveland from the agency to do a scripted stream called The Black Stream. This included allegations of secret recordings. They alleged that Selene had been secretly recording voice calls with management and other talents without their consent or knowledge. Legal threats and doxing fears. They claimed that Selene's legal counsel had sent documents to the company that contained the real names and personal information of other VTubers. The talents stated this made them feel unsafe and terrified of being doxed, framing their legal defense of her out-of-pocket costs as a physical threat to her co-workers, creating a toxic environment. Vox Akuma specifically alleged that Selene's actions and complaints were manipulative and created a hostile work environment for the management, staff, and other talent. Breach of trust. They framed her decision to release her privately funded music video, which management had stalled, as a malicious breach of trust that forced the company's hand. The backlash against the agency was immediate, and the use of other talent as a shield for the company's actions was seen as disingenuous. This caused sponsors and independents to distance themselves from the agency and the three streamers themselves. The backlash is ongoing for the three talents that were on the Black Stream. They all immediately started hemorrhaging subscribers. They also had to take extended hiatuses. They are all back to streaming now, but their reputations are permanently damaged. They are essentially radioactive outside of the agency bubble they operate in, and their view count is a fraction of what it was previously, resulting in a huge loss of revenue to the agency, which is still having impact to this day. By following corporate orders to protect the agency's IP, they effectively destroyed the value of their own personas. Selene was able to immediately pick up her indie name and persona as Dokibird and was able to continue on and become a hugely successful indie streamer. Disposable organic hardware. VTubing agencies have refined the J and K-pop trainee model into a purely digital supply chain. The human is hardware that must be maintained at minimum cost. When an agency asset burns out or malfunctions, they are replaceable. A bit of new art and a new enthusiastic talent with a dream, little knowledge of finance, and almost no coping methods, and the cycle begins again. The Neuro Paradox. For 500 years, people in power have viewed talent as a necessary annoyance, needed to create the product, but a hassle to pay and treat like humans. The ultimate goal has always been a fully integrated, fully automated production line for media, and with the advent of LLMs and AI, that may become possible, especially within the VTuber space. That brings us to Vettel 987, Neurosama, and Evil, and Filter Sama, of course. When Vettel made an AI to play Osu, he proved the concept. The evolution has been incredible, but it is a unique case in the industry, for now. Neuro is unique in that she was created out of the want to create, not the want to generate revenue. The threat to the human creator is clear in the existence of Neuro, but the reality of that threat doesn't lay with Neuro, it lays with who controls the technology. The threat is that the people in charge of the agencies and media conglomerates have repeatedly shown that the human asset means nothing to them except the revenue generated. The ability to exploit humans paired with an AI model that can be live 24/7 and always hit those parasocial beats is the recipe for the end of human talent, and the inability to meaningfully tell the difference. And that's pretty much all I have to say on that. I'm BitCat. I hope you like this. Please like, comment, subscribe, support independent creators, be sus of agencies, and know the background before you glaze anyone or anything. Thanks for getting to this point if you're hearing me talk right now. Yeah, you're awesome.